So people end up following different paths based on what they've achieved, but they're not limited in terms of getting into that next level. I want to talk about 3 distance providers because the focus is on open and distance schooling. So the first one, Te Kura, is, which is Māori for the school, is what used to be called the Correspondence Institute. So that was established in 1922 in New Zealand, which was the distance learning provider for preschool to year 13, which is our final year. In 1928, they enrolled their first secondary students, and they have 24,000 learners. A big driver for Te Kura when it was set up was access for rural learners. We have the strong agricultural base, and there were a lot of people that didn't have any school near them. We have some islands, and people on these islands didn't have a school. But the focus for Te Kura is changing in 2 ways. The first is that they increasingly offer individual subjects. So somebody is enrolled in a school, it could be an urban school. My children have a friend who studied French through Te Kura because there wasn't a French teacher at her school. And that's really being driven by the fact that there's so many different subjects being offered in the curriculum in New Zealand. You know, we used to have kind of, you did sciences or you did arts, or you did the commercial subjects. Whereas now people do a mix and match, and it's very hard for schools to timetable or to have the skills, the teacher expertise. So Te Kura picks up those students, and that includes vocational subjects, because those unit standards are on the qualifications framework, and they're the same throughout the country. The other group that Te Kura are increasingly working with is what we might call the disadvantaged youth, the youth that don't behave properly in schools, and after they get expelled a few times, Te Kura picks up, and they are giving quite individualised learning programs, and there's a focus on work placements, and they have an advisor allocated to them. So they work through the resources that the Te Kura has, but they are given quite a different learning experience because we're really trying, you know, as a country, it's worth helping them get into a workplace rather than have them continue to be unable to learn and participate. We also have this virtual learning network, which is run by the ministry, and again, it's a way of dealing with the fact that individual schools may not have the resources to offer subjects, and it's using various online tools so that a teacher in one part of the country can timetable their session, and students from all around New Zealand can web conference with them, and then they can work through self-paced materials and interact socially with the other students as well. And the ministry provides the infrastructure and teacher professional development. And then the final example is the Open Polytechnic. We began in 1944, do open and distance learning. The STAR programs is secondary and tertiary alignment something. I've forgotten what the R stands for, but it's really giving secondary students the chance to start studying tertiary courses, and again, vocational unit standards that they can have under their belt because they're not going to go on to higher education. And we have some students choosing to do that with us by distance. We also offer foundation programs, so that's at the equivalent of the secondary school level on our qualifications framework, so levels 1 to 4. And in the last 10 years, we've had 60,000 learners go through these programs where they're developing basic life skills and literacy and numeracy. So these tend to be people who have not succeeded in their first go at secondary education. So another element of ideal distance vocational education is transferability, and all those 3 models are teaching unit standards from the National Qualifications Framework. So while in theory you would think that would work really well, in practice there is some challenge with recognition because, for example, you might do a hospitality chef course at the secondary school, but there's no industrial ovens available, and so then they need to repeat that when they go on to the tertiary institution because they have the industrial oven. And that's one of the challenges of open schooling versus the formal tertiary, I think, is it's not possible to have that infrastructure in place all across. The other is that if it's a face-to-face tertiary institute, they may not be flexible enough in their delivery to not cover the unit standards during the face-to-face time, so the student ends up repeating it anyway. Another element of distance vocational education that's important to consider is quality. And I've listed there really the developments, the elements that it's important to think about in terms of quality. And a key thing in New Zealand is that we are very activities focused in our learning design. We really focus on getting the learners to process for themselves rather than this sort of format where you're all sitting there and I'm just talking at you. It's much more interactive, and that's a very important part, particularly in vocational education. In our universities, they've been a bit slower to move that way, but the vocational education providers have had that emphasis. Another way that we ensure quality in New Zealand is that the distance providers are reviewed by the same quality assurance bodies as the face-to-face institutions, and my understanding is that it's different here. So for Te Kura and VLM, because they're schools, the Education Review Office comes in and does an assessment of them, and those reports are publicly available for anybody in the country to read, well, anyone in the world to read. So that, you know, the quality standards are exactly the same for a distance education provider, and similarly for the Open Polytechnic, it's the New Zealand Qualifications Authority. And we've just changed our review process, the NZQA has, where they've changed from kind of almost a tick the box, prove that you're doing certain things, to what they're wanting to measure is that you are measuring things yourself as an organisation and thinking about how to improve. Also wanted to talk about this aspect of quality because my sense is that distance education is seen as a second-class option in India, and that because people keep saying to me, how do you assure quality? Whereas in New Zealand we don't have that problem. We have this long history, you know, nearly 100 years of distance education, and people don't tend to think of it as not being quality. And I would argue that in some sense you can be more sure of quality in distance education because you're embedding the pedagogy in the materials, and it's the human factor that is so variable and so hard to get right in education. And you actually decrease the impact of that human variable component. And also you decrease dependence on the subject matter expertise because, again, you've embedded that in the material. You only need to have one subject matter expert, or maybe two, because you have somebody that comes in and reviews it, and then that can be spread out to millions and millions of people. So yeah, I think quality and distance education go very well together. Which brings me on to another aspect, which is distance vocational education being well perceived. And as I've said, we have the same standards and evaluators, so it's not a problem. But also I think it's about marketing clearly so people know that it's a different product and students have an understanding of what's expected of them and how the model is different. And finally, cost effectiveness. So technology can really make a difference in open vocational education if it's used appropriately. So we're moving a lot to automated feedback and assessment, which again decreases your reliance on the teacher. It decreases the variable costs, but it also it ensures a consistent experience across. Online enrolment is a much better experience from the student perspective. Online tracking, so that you can actually see whether a learner is engaged early on and then intervene with a human element to motivate them to get going. Whereas when we just dealt with print materials, you didn't actually know till the first assessment was due and whether they'd even opened their box of materials. Multimedia and simulations are very good at communicating difficult concepts, and then forums and social media allow more interaction both between the students and the teacher and the students and the students. And then the distance economies of scale. And we observe those in New Zealand where we only have a handful of people. In India, I think the distance economies will be just so much more significant. As I've said, you have the one-off fixed cost for materials development, and also you can reuse bits of it. And again, if you think about our qualifications, which are made up of these unit standards where some are repeated across, you can actually pick up this bit from here and reuse it there. You decrease the variable costs, and there's no need for that physical infrastructure. So in conclusion, New Zealand, through several providers with different models, offers relevant, accessible, transferable and quality vocational education to late secondary school children. This is well perceived and cost effective. Thank you.